Hi, I'm Charley Rose here with psychedelicinvest.com. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be sitting down with Mydecine CEO Josh Bartch. I got a chance to speak with him last week about all the big changes that have been going on within the company. If you want to read more about that, you can go check out my article on psychedelicinvest.com and we'll link it below. Today, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive into the challenges that Josh and his company have faced as they're building a psychedelic biotech company. I hope you enjoy. Let's get started. Hey, Josh, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Fabulous. Well, to get started, I'd love if you take a few minutes to tell our viewers what drew you into the psychedelic space and what you hope to accomplish you personally within it.
Yeah, sure. So I think everybody has that kind of why that's in the industry, or for that matter, really in any industry. But for me, I grew up with a family that has suffered from addiction, and it's been very prevalent throughout my family. And I've seen just firsthand what those effects on people and how it can affect a family and friendships, and have serious lasting effects, not only obviously death and other things associated, but through the process it can be extremely deteriorating to a family kind of atmosphere and in friendship atmosphere as well. And there's just no good solutions. And I watched friends and families bounce in and out of rehab, spend huge sums of money on rehabs that the model is built on retention, right? They don't want you to get healthy. They don't want you to be, cured and get better, because they thrive off retention rates, right? That's how they literally make their money. So if you go and you get better, then their model doesn't work, and from a pharmaceutical standpoint, there's nothing effective in addiction, really. There's a lot of off-label use, and a lot of the same off-label use is being used for things like PTSD and other interests that we have as well. So that was kind of the initial interest, that really got me intrigued into psychedelics, that maybe there's an alternative form of treatment that has been overlooked that's incredibly effective. You go back, kind of look at the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. The founder of Alcoholics Anonymous was convinced that LSD was literally that kind of magic drug that could potentially cure alcoholism. And now with the resurgence of research, you're really starting to see compelling evidence that it's not only potentially effective for alcohol use disorder, but obviously something that we're very interested in, which is nicotine, which is an addiction to me that is, one, it kills more people on the planet than any other substance, combined. Literally all the other substances combined. Wow. Smoking is killing vastly more, 480,000 people annually in the United States alone dying of smoking. But what's really interesting to me about smoking as an addiction is, if you look at like a rehab center, you go outside and everybody's sitting around smoking, right? So it's completely overlooked and bypassed for whatever reason. I think a lot of it has to do with just the immense amount of money that flows in from tobacco lobbying, and the way that it's been kind of portrayed. But, anyways, needless to say. And then after, kind of getting involved in the industry, early on, we acquired a company by the name of Neuropharm, and their main focus was PTSD. And again, I think everybody, has at least somebody that they know that's been affected by a veteran coming home, and just the lasting effects that has, while they were overseas and fighting for, their country and fighting for the people back home, and they come home, and again, they're kind of just forgotten about in many instances. And there's really been no advancements in pharmaceutical drug development over the last several decades for PTSD. And after we brought on the colleagues like our chief medical officer, Dr. Rakesh Jetley, who spent 31 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, the last 10 as the chief of psychiatry for the Canadian Armed Forces, and hearing some of their firsthand stories and really just understanding in and outs of the deficiencies of the available treatments, that kind of expanded my motivation, I guess, and passion for, looking at better ways to bring these different types of medicines, and maybe there's a better option. And I think that there definitely is in psychedelics. So long-winded answer, but hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also leads great into my next question. So Mydecine is focused on utilizing the existing healthcare structures and models and integrating psychedelic treatments rather than trying to, construct a whole new model for it. And I'm curious to hear how you think integrating the psychedelic medicines into that model are going to change it.
Yeah, sure. So I think, I'll step back and talk about kind of the evolution of Mydecine and kind of what we've learned, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
But how we've evolved to have that as our mission and vision statement, that we see success when we create medicines that are moldable and fit into the existing infrastructure, as opposed to this unique psychedelic kind of clinic infrastructure. So early on, I think that there's, again, we spoke about this last week. There's no blueprint, right? And it's uncharted territories, and it's very different than traditional pharmaceutical drug development in the sense that you have this therapy aspect attached to the medicine and the treatments. And I think that there's a strong argument, and we're definitely of the belief as well, that the two are cohesive and they are important, and the one is not nearly as effective without the other.
Absolutely.
So, when you look at kind of that being a fact, if it is true, then how do you scale that? And how do you make that something that is affordable and accessible to, the broader market, not just kind of the people that can afford to go to, for instance, like a $30,000 a month rehab? They could probably afford this type of treatment, but the general public cannot, right? And it's also going to be a big roadblock, which we believe, with insurance companies coming in and stepping in and paying for that type of treatment that has hundreds of hours of therapy associated with a single treatment, or even tens of hours of therapy, right? So, early on, we saw those deficiencies and looked at ways to kind of maybe fix that or step in. And that was the idea behind MindLeap, is how do we, give the therapy remotely, so it saves costs, it makes it accessible, so people don't have to travel redundantly weekly over a set period of time. And we tried to operate in several verticals. Ultimately, again, we've evolved and said, I think the best point of focus for Mydecine, and something that we've done and made significant advancements in, is instead of trying to do everything and trying to operate in every vertical, why don't we just focus and really do an incredible and a very efficient job at just one vertical? And ultimately that is in drug development, and looking at, we know that the efficacy rates of these, at least what's being shown in clinical trials currently, that there's incredible efficacy rates on these different types of treatment. But again, we like to use the analogy that if you look at like MAPS's protocol and kind of MAPS's overall expense, et cetera, 2 therapists, several hours of therapy, multiple treatments, et cetera, it's very hard to scale that. And the analogy that we'll use is, they can treat the first class of the airplane. We want to treat the general coach class, right? So the only way to do that is to fix several problems with the medicine, most notably the half-life, onset and half-life. Now, how do you increase the half-life? How do you increase the onset and control the overall half-life while maintaining the same sort of effect that you want to see? And it's difficult, and it's unproven, but it's definitely something that, we believe that we're able to accomplish and have made significant progress towards. And I think there's several other groups trying to accomplish the same thing with kind of different or like-minded approaches, but it has to be done from the molecular level. And again, if you can create, for instance, an MDMA, which is something that we're focused on, that has an hour-long half-life, and from start to finish, that's something that's not this crazy psychedelic experience. MDMA, you're fully cognitive. It's not as scary to the general public. That can be an incredibly effective tool for your existing therapist to administer maybe once a quarter, maybe once a month, to have a breakthrough therapy session with you where you are able to go much deeper, drop the barriers, and then your regularly scheduled therapy sessions that you have had a relationship with this person for a long time can be more effective, right? And theoretically, I think that's something that could penetrate the market, that you can go and would be adopted by your existing therapist. So somebody that you already have a relationship with, you wouldn't have to go to a super unique place that, you have comfortable bed, comfortable couches with tie-dyed pillows and all these different things, right? It can be in your existing medical infrastructure, and something that I think could be also adopted by the general public very, very fast. So keeping that sort of, mindset is really what's driven our drug design efforts and kind of our overall mission and vision that we're pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you guys get to the stage where you have these drugs available with the shorter half-life, I know you submitted the patent for your MDMA family a couple months ago. How do you plan to get that into these therapist offices?
Yeah, sure. So that is a traditional drug development route. Now, there's different approaches for our different families of molecules. So MYCO-004 is a prodrug family of psilocin. So this was designed with a feature set that acts as a prodrug. So psilocybin is a prodrug of psilocin as it stands in nature. The family of molecules that we designed is also a prodrug of psilocin. So after the modification that we made to the molecule is cleaved off, your end result is a psilocin molecule. But what we initially designed it for, that family of molecules, is to be skin permeable. So it very efficiently goes through the skin, both hydrophobic and hydrophilic membranes. It very efficiently goes through. So that could also be delivered in an oral capsule and be more efficiently digested and absorbed throughout the process, which would increase the onset time, eliminate some of the variability, and shorten the overall experience time. But at the end of the day, you're left with a psilocin active. So we believe that the efficacy rates should be identical to what's currently being shown in traditional psilocybin, but it's a fully patented NCE. It's 100% owned by Mydecine. There is a development pathway called 505(b)(2) prodrug equivalency that allows you to essentially run, amongst other things, but essentially show bioequivalency with PK/PD studies, et cetera, in a small phase one in healthy normals, and then bypass a significant amount of the steps in between to immediately be eligible to move into a late stage pivotal trial. So that's something that we're pursuing, that one is incredibly efficient, cost effective, allows us to move into our later stage study partner that we partnered with Hopkins on for smoking cessation, with a fully patented, improved second generation drug that you can hypothesize that should be significantly de-risked, right? Because we know what psilocin does in the body. We know the cleavage rates of our drugs. We know that the additions are healthy and safe, and have been proven, over drug design for several years. And again, you know what I mean? A much shorter path to approval. The MYCO-006 family, the MDMA analogs, those are brand new chemical entities. So that is a much longer process. So for something like that, the strategy that Mydecine has, we want to prove it out in preclinical and animal studies, that it does what we think it does, that it is acting very similar to MDMA, and you can show that with discrimination assays in animals where they are trained to prefer MDMA over something else, over amphetamine, for instance. And then you give them your drug with amphetamine, and if they choose your drug, then it shows that it's having kind of the same effect that MDMA has. There's a variety of other unique tests that you can kind of show that it's acting like MDMA, but being able to show that the half-life is significantly shorter and onset is faster, et cetera. Once you get to that stage, Mydecine has built a business model that's very modular. Our patent portfolio is very modular, and it allows for partnerships, joint development of many different types, collaboration with other groups, licensing, et cetera. So, we have the full intention to be able to work with other groups, pharmaceutical companies, other groups that are like-minded, et cetera, that have the expertise to take it into later stage clinicals, et cetera. And that's kind of true for, the breadth of our families of molecules and kind of the model that we're moving forward. What that does is it hedges out on Mydecine success, because you have, multiple shots on goal. And in addition to that, we don't need to raise $100 million to be successful, right? We can do what we do very efficiently and very well.
Mhm.
We're partnered with one of the top 15 in the world drug development universities. At the University of Alberta, they're top 3 in the world for AI. We've invested a very large sum of money over the last 2 years at that university. And now it's just a very efficiently run drug development platform that has end-to-end capabilities that we can literally start from conceptual design phase, go through all the synthesis, benchtop, work it through the AI, and it acts as a feedback loop to inform kind of the new design of our drugs, to have very intentional, purposeful changes to these molecules, and very high likelihood of success on our lead candidate. And at that point, we can also run animal studies very efficiently and very cost effectively out of the University of Alberta as well. We have full CGMP pharmaceutical manufacturing there, et cetera. So we can literally go from A to Z and package up a drug that's ready for the next phase, and then look to partner, or if it's something that we want to continue with. So again, a very, very sustainable, very cost effective evolution of business, I should say. Something that we fit in to that kind of area of the drug development genesis, and something that we think that we're very comfortable and have a high likelihood of success at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to move more into that idea. You say a lot about, being efficient and cost effective. When we spoke last week, you mentioned that you and your team in the early stages of the company came out a little bit too hot and too fast. And could you talk a little bit more about what you meant by that, and also what advice you would give to someone who might be in those stages of their own company so that they don't make the same mistakes?
Yeah, sure. So again, I think this happens with startups of all different sectors, and definitely in new, exciting markets where there's many verticals that have huge potential, and that people are excited about, and we were excited about. And we tried to tackle too much early on. Money was free flowing. There was a huge, very easy access to capital. And, I don't think that anybody saw the extreme downturn that took place in biotech more broadly, and psychedelics more exemplified, and hit harder than biotech more broadly. Nobody saw that coming, and if you did, then you had insight that that we didn't, I guess. So, we were budgeting off of a projected rate of being able to raise capital at a specific market cap that would be less dilutive. And we came out with, several ambitions. We had, the Functional Mushroom Lab in Colorado. We had MindLeap, which is a technology platform, which they're expensive to develop. They occupy a lot of resources. And then we had our drug development and also multiple clinical trials. We're sponsoring preclinical. So, ultimately, we had to step back and really analyze and literally go through and line item each staff member, and their contributions, and how much money were we spending on that specific job, and do we have people that could double up or absorb that, or is it better to outsource some of that, or if some of the work that we had outsourced, is it better to bring that in-house. So we had to do that with not only our staff members, but also we had to do that with each and every project, or goal, or that we had either launched or were potentially going to launch, and step back and analyze each one in a very finite matter, and say, okay, maybe we want to continue with this, maybe we don't, and look at what's the upside, what's the dollars involved, and how do we get there, and do we have a clear path to success on this initiative? And if the answer is no, then we either need to discontinue it or put it in the hands of somebody that can bring it to that next level that we benefit from. So, that's what we did. And we spent the last 6 months overhauling the company, refining our plan, looking at different partnerships and ways to increase efficiencies, but we wanted to maintain obviously the upside of the drug, and we've effectively done that. We own all of our molecules. We own 100% of our IP. We have an exclusive partnership with our drug development partner, Applied Pharmaceutical Innovation. We have a very, very unique platform. And again, a lot of the drug development infrastructure that we built was front loaded, right? A lot of that is physical infrastructure that you need. That's a one-time cost, and then you're paying for staff members. So we employ and we staff, several PhDs from a variety of different backgrounds. These are some of the top medicinal chemists in the world. Have hundreds of years of drug development experience, and that's really our cost. We've looked at our C-suite, and we've been deferring salaries for several months, and we'll continue to do so as long as our balance sheet is where it's at, to make sure that the vast majority of the capital CapEx is going directly to R&D, as opposed to being distributed in other ways that we can avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there, going back, I mean, obviously we can only look forward, but is there anything that you would have changed in those early stages? Now looking back, knowing what you know?
Sure, I would have had a crystal ball that you can anticipate, what's going to happen in the market. I don't know. I mean, of course, I think hindsight's 2020, and there's ways and areas and projects that didn't pan out like we thought they were going to, or took more money and didn't produce what we thought they're going to. But again, we're in R&D. If you look at the failure rates of drugs, for instance, it's incredibly high. It's freakish. It's scary high, right? So ultimately, I think what we've fallen on, we wouldn't have gotten there if we didn't make several of these mistakes. And ultimately, I think that the company has a very high likelihood of success. And we've pulled back a lot, but again, the upside is still there. It's a long run. It's a long game. And I think that the investor base, you kind of have two different types of investors, and some that understand that biotech takes several years for a drug to become successful and make any sort of money. And if it is successful, then there's a huge pot of gold at the end, not only for the company, but also for the patient if you make a good drug. And the reality of it is that it takes time. And then you still have, I think, kind of that retail cannabis investor that doesn't understand that. And they're like, where's the money? How come they're not doing this? What's going on? How come they're not producing any revenue? This is garbage. And they just don't understand what drug development is. And, there's companies in the space that have clinics and things like that have revenue now, and maybe that's a better place for some of these investors. But any company that's developing drugs, it's a long-term game, and it takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And biotech companies that are pre-revenue rely on investors to continue to raise money. And you do that by putting out good data, putting out good drugs, and putting forth a good foot forward. And sometimes you hit home runs, sometimes you don't. You know what I mean? So there's several things that I would change. Hindsight is 2020, but ultimately, I think that we weathered the storm and we made it through, and we're coming out the other side a much better and improved company.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting point you make about the retail cannabis investor then kind of moving into the psychedelic space and expecting it to be similar when there's such entirely different compounds. And we've been seeing that a lot in Oregon with Measure 109, where people think it's going to be the same thing, but it's not cannabis that you can just smoke, after work at night.
Exactly.
People don't really realize that. So I want to backtrack a little bit. When we spoke last, you had some really interesting insights about what happened in December to psychedelic stocks, and I'd love if you could share that with our viewers.
Yeah, sure. So I think that the entire industry, myself included, and I can't generalize and say the entire industry, but I think everybody that we spoke to, and we talked to a lot of people that had very strong insights into how Compass's phase 2B results were going to come out, and it was overwhelmingly positive. Ultimately, they came out and their stock crashed, and the industry follows kind of the big boys. And once they start crashing, the industry crashes. And I think, what happened was a couple of things. One, there wasn't a lot of context around the severity of, the indication that they're trying to treat, right? This is an indication that these are severely depressed individuals that have tried absolutely everything that is known, and it's all failed, right? 30% of them are suicidal, and ultimately 100% of them are probably hopeless, right? Because absolutely nothing has worked. So a drug that comes in and shows 25% success rate in a population that's literally untreatable is a blockbuster drug. Those are efficacy rates you don't see. Again, I related it to cancer drugs, and you look at success rates in chemotherapy and things like this, right? That are in the single digits, the low single digits, and those are effective. Why? Because you have an untreatable indication that is terminal, that you now have something that works. And even if it works a fraction of the time, it's better than zero, right? So, there wasn't a lot of context around it when it should have been incredibly well received, I think, because they're very, very positive results. The other thing that I think the reason why that probably happened, the reason why people saw 25% as a failure, is what happened, when it's absolutely not, is because they benchmarked it against MAPS's clinical results, which came out at high 60s complete remission, 80% significant reduction in symptoms, and those are out of control results that you don't see. But I think that now you're starting to see, and listen, we're big champions of MAPS, and we want them to succeed, and we think that the drugs will. But again, there's differences in the population that they were treating. These are people with PTSD, but it's not severe PTSD, and it wasn't all severely ill PTSD patients. In addition to that, Compass's results had a single dosing session, as opposed to 3 in MAPS. The therapy hours were significantly lower in Compass's treatment, as compared to MAPS, et cetera. So there's a lot of differences in those studies, and I think they drew just a direct benchmarking against it, and was like, whoa, that drug does this drug does this, it must be a failure, and they must all be failures. So ultimately that really was, maybe a much needed, I might say, as bad as that sound, a much needed kind of sobering pill for the industry, whereas people understand that these, 100% of them aren't going to be successful, and it's not going to cure you forever. It's not the magic potion. They do show a ton of promise, but it's not the magic potion. But I think that there was an overcorrection for sure, and it's really had potential negative impact on the company. I think every company in the space, for the most part, has halted certain projects. Even the well-funded guys, they really had to step back and look at how they're deploying capital. A lot of staffing cuts. You saw Compass laid off 20% or so of their staff at one point, et cetera. So it was felt throughout the entire industry for sure. But I think that was the initial catalyst that ultimately did it. And then there were several subsequent events, and then obviously the broader markets crashed, and then you have inflation, and you have all kinds of different other factors. That was kind of a snowball effect.
Yeah, the perfect storm.
It was the unperfect storm, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. That idea of this sort of magic pill, that like you said, that idea kind of came crashing down. How do you think that is part of the psychedelic industry today? Are people really steering away from that, or do you feel like a lot of people are still kind of holding to that idea? If that makes sense.
I think that it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
There was a great article that just came out in Wired that really kind of drew light to that, and basically said, listen, it's the responsibility of the scientists to really talk about this in a true context. Whereas, yes, these drugs are showing significant efficacy rates. The safety profiles are freakishly safe compared to other pharmaceuticals. However, these are still clinical development drugs, right? There's not a single approval. They haven't been commercialized. We don't know how they're gonna do on the general market. There's a lot of problems with the scalability and just the infrastructure that's required. So I think that it needs to be really looked at from both ways. However, with that being said, I do think that these are absolutely significantly better than what's currently available on the market. But it's not just take a pill and you're going to be cured forever, right? I mean, that's just not the facts, and I don't think it's ever going to be the case. And I think it's really important that you don't send that message to try to give that false hope to people that this is going to do it for you no matter what. Go do ayahuasca in the jungle and it's going to be you're cured forever, right? And that's not the case. So I think that it's really the responsibility of companies, executives of companies, people with public voices, and then also the researchers, that you want to make sure that you're shedding these in a positive light, because they are positive, and the rates are coming out incredible, but not taking it and blowing out into proportion that these are the cure everything, because ultimately what that does is delegitimize the industry. You saw that with cannabis, for instance, right? This is going to cure everything. And we don't want to be portrayed in that same light. We want to do good research. We want to develop drugs that are safe and effective, and bring them to market in a proper way, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that idea is specific to the psychedelic industry. We've kind of fallen into this pattern as a society of take this pill, do this diet, and you'll be fixed. And that's really where I wanted to start writing, is because I would see these articles that were like, this is the magic fix, this is the magic fix. And, you'd start going into those studies and see that, okay, maybe there's some viability here, but it's not, going to fix all your problems. And it'll be really interesting to see how the psychedelic industry challenges that, because we've fallen into it a little bit as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the research is in its infancy, right? I mean, if you look at, again, historically, we're building off a ton of clinical work that was being done, right? But these are with generation 1 drugs. These are with traditional LSD, traditional psilocybin, et cetera, traditional MDMA. So after you modify the molecules, nobody knows how these things are going to act, right? If you shorten the half-life, it's all, theoreticals, hypothesis. It's all people just taking guesses, right? And we don't know. And you can see it in animal models. You can see it in, benchtop. And now, some companies are getting that second generation drug into humans. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to see kind of how these second generation of drugs are going to work. And, I think that the first generation of drugs, I think that they work great. They do for certain indications. But again, they have significant limitations that people really need to understand. And the other issue with those drugs and psychedelics more broadly, I think we're going to see FDA approval far before we see general population adoption. And I think they're two very different things. Whereas if you want a successful drug, you need your general physician that you trust and that the general people trust to look at this as a legitimate frontline form of treatment, and not this taboo, holy cow, I can't believe you're going to do that, or I would never do that type of thing, because of the context that it's been, put out in society. And I think there's, potential landmines in the industry, some of these state programs that are being run, et cetera, and how those are going to roll out is really important, that they're done responsibly, because we want people to look at this as not a joke, or not a, something that only hippies do, or something that, holy cow, that's out of the realm of something that normal people would ever do, right? And ultimately, that's I think that learning curve and that adoption curve is going to be much slower than probably the approval of these different medicines, which limits the progression of the drugs. Because the second kind of catalyst that we're going to see, well, there'll be several, because we'll have clinical readouts, but when MAPS or Compass commercializes those drugs, how those drugs penetrate the market and revenue that's produced, patients that are seen, is going to be really important to kind of that next wave of how people treat the industry from an investment standpoint. And is it going to be a positive thing, or are we going to have another one of these, reversals, and it's still completely unknown and yet to be seen.
So where the drugs that our Mydecine is developing, and one similar from other companies, where do you see those in, let's say, 3 to 5 years?
3 years, I think that we'll have drugs to market. I think that Mydecine will have a drug on the market. Our Myco 004 compound, I think, will be very close to being on the market. I think Compass will have a drug on the market. I think MAPS will have a drug on the market, and maybe a couple others. And I think, at that point, it's going to be important that you have, and this is probably a view that a lot in this industry hate to hear, but it's really important that we have partners with legitimate pharmaceutical companies, progressive pharmaceutical companies like Jazz Pharmaceuticals that have already kind of entered into the cannabis space, and we know that they're thinking progressively, but have that balance sheet that can do real large marketing campaigns to make these successful drugs. But I think it's imperative, because you look at some of the bigger companies in the space that have $100 million, $200 million on the balance sheet. That's nothing in the pharmaceutical realm, right? And to bring these drugs to a real successful commercial drug, it's going to take serious infrastructure. It's going to take serious dollars, and it's going to take a lot of support. And it's going to be important that in these later stage drug development or even early on, that you look to partner with some of these companies that are able to do that, because again, you only get one chance to make a first impression, and I think that's very true in many different circumstances, but definitely when you have a brand new drug that's unproven coming out to a market and nobody knows how it's going to do, you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward, and that maybe check the ego at the door and maybe be open to partnerships like that, and understand that it's a necessary evil, if you will. But I think it's very important that you need that type of partnership. And if that does happen, and you see some of these larger companies come in and support the later stage drug development, then I think in 3 to 5 years, you're going to see a serious renaissance. Whereas these drugs are coming to market, they're helping people in a very big way. You're starting to see real-time success stories, and then word of mouth is going to spread from people that have been helped by these drugs, and it's really going to penetrate the market in a big way and change people's mindsets, change people's perception on these drugs. And ultimately, I think it should lead to a thriving pharmaceutical drug market for psychedelics, but also a thriving mental health and addiction market. Whereas we're actually starting to see advancements and actually starting to see people get better. So, that's what I hope. But I firmly believe that will happen for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree. We need these big pharmaceutical companies to make psychedelic treatments widespread. What would be some of the concerns going into those partnerships?
They have competing drugs, right? And there's a lot of motivation potentially for these companies to kill the psychedelic markets. And if they buy into a drug and decide that they don't want to bring it to the market and they control the rights to it, you see that a lot where these pharmaceutical companies, there's a lot of intellectual property and really promising early stage drugs that get killed in the early stage development, and patents get purchased from these big pharmaceutical companies, and they have the potential to help a large population, but it competes with one of their blockbuster drugs. So they kill it, right? And I think that's definitely a potential here for sure. Something that you need to be, that companies need to be aware of when they're negotiating contracts and looking at different partnerships as to what is the real intention and what's the motivation, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've already touched on some of these, and I'm curious if we can get into some more. So other than the obvious, difficulties, regulatory, social stigma, like we we're just talking about pharmaceutical, what are some of the challenges that psychedelic biotech companies are specifically facing in this space?
Yeah, so I think you touched on the known, issues. The other thing is that is limiting, but it's from regulatory side, but people don't notice it, and definitely the general investor doesn't notice it because they want things to happen yesterday.
Yeah.
The process for a scheduled substance to do research on is much longer, and approvals take a lot longer. For instance, if you want to run an animal study on a scheduled substance, in Canada, for instance, you need a section 56 exemption, which is very specific and takes quite a while to get that approval, right? And in other drugs or other just new chemical entities that aren't scheduled substances, you just go to the ethics board, you apply for your approval to run the study, and you get approval. There's several extra layers, and that limits your ability to go to any facility that you want to that offers these different types of studies, because a lot of them just don't carry that type of licensing, and they don't want to, right? Because it's more of a headache than it is beneficial, because the limited number of clients that they could potentially garner from going through the paperwork, the expense, the time, et cetera, associated with getting those types of licensure. So that's definitely a big hurdle for sure. Outside of that, I don't think that there's a ton. I think that there's potential landmines in the industry, and a lot of that comes from, again, you look at some of these state programs, and I hope that they're done responsibly, and I hope that people, and they only allow good actors to operate these, and they keep it very controlled. But I think that all of those types of initiatives are potentially dangerous. And look at kind of what happened in the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s. It's exactly that, right? I mean, the data that was coming out of the clinic was incredibly compelling. Then it escapes the lab, it goes into a recreational setting, and all of a sudden everything is halted. It goes on the Schedule I list and completely changes the progression of where these drugs would be now. So, I think that those are big challenges that we have to maintain, kind of, that mindset, I guess. And you have an industry that has a very, very weird dichotomy in the types of people and kind of the mindset, I guess, of different types of people that are in the industry. Some understand that it needs to be drug development and you need to change the molecules if you really want to treat large patient populations, and some think that you're the devil if you touch the molecule and you mess with the mushroom, right? So it's one of those things that it's definitely a challenge, and it's definitely hurdles, and ultimately, I think that that will kind of weed itself out. And
so what are some of these landmines that companies and investors should be anticipating?
Yeah, I think that, again, expectations they need to be real. And if they're not, then people are going to be constantly let down. Right? And they're going to feel like people lied to them, and all these different things. And I think that they really need to understand what drug development is, and understand that a lot of these drugs that are going into phase 1 right now, that have shorter half-lives and have all these improvements, et cetera, like those are unproven new chemical entities, right? They're based off psychedelics that are showing promise. But for the most part, the first generation of drugs are still unproven as well, right? So they're based off something that we think is significantly de-risking it. But again, nobody knows how an hour-long psilocybin analog is going to have an effect on depression or anything for that matter, right? So, I think that they really need to understand that just because a company is moving into phase 1 with a drug before 10 other companies or everybody else, they're the first to the phase 1, that means absolutely nothing, right? That means absolutely nothing, because just because somebody can get there faster doesn't mean they got there better. And the vast majority of drugs fail in phase 1 and phase 2. And I think that's going to happen probably with a lot of these second generation NCEs, and it's not being talked about, and it's not being really looked at as to what are the changes that they made to the molecule, and how is that going to affect the human and the overall efficacy rate. So I think that people really need to be sober about how they think about that, and companies really need to be humble in how they talk about their drugs, I guess, and realistic on how they talk about their drugs. So it's not just these massive letdowns that have another catalytic event that crashes the market even more, right? So, I think that those are definitely issues. I've touched on it a bunch. I think that the recreational market is always dangerous. And, I'm not a believer that these should be accessible by anybody in any context that they want, right? I think that in the right set and setting with the right trained professionals and the right preparation, that they're very effective. But I also think that they're dangerous for sure, just for people to be taking, right? Like you touched on earlier, these are not, sorry, my phone's ringing. These are not, this isn't cannabis, right? This isn't smoke a joint after work, or, some people smoke joints before work. These are serious drugs, right?
Yeah.
And the
Definitely don't want to do it before work.
No, the effects that they have are very profound. And again, you know what I mean? It can be scary for people. It's a very unique experience. And they need to be done in a controlled environment and responsibly, administered and given out and manufactured and all of the above. And I think that, there's definitely an underground scene that completely disagrees with what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I think that's potentially dangerous to the overall success of the industry as well. So,
kind of how it has been in the past.
Exactly. And I think that, this is hopefully not a situation where history repeats itself, because you saw it actually happen in the past, where there was incredible research being done. And because they were taken out of the lab and the underground blew them up, and for many other political reasons, but you saw that it can absolutely happen. And this isn't something that we want to let happen. And if it's not, people aren't responsible and serious about these different substances, then it could potentially happen again. And that's a big landmine, right? Because if that happens and everybody gets wiped off, and the federal government takes the stance that they're Schedule 1, we're not going to let you develop it, you can't do it, et cetera. We're never going to reschedule these drugs no matter what, then all this is for naught. And that's something that I don't see happening, just because of the amount of research that's being done now and the amount of publicity that's being done, and also the several different jurisdictions globally that are allowing and supporting the research. There'd have to be continuity for that to stop, but I don't see that happening. But anyways, it's definitely a problem. But I think ultimately, and we've been saying it a lot, I think the recreational market probably offers the biggest issues there.
Yeah, and you brought up another really interesting point about the sort of disconnect between investors who want to see really fast results, which can sometimes push these companies to move too fast and to, just say really high things about their drugs or products that are a little bit inflated. So how do you think companies manage that?
Yeah, I think that we're probably guilty of that as well. You know what I mean? Trying to move, and that's good, because we want it can be good, because you want research to progress, and we push our team very, very hard, and we push our team very, very hard because we want results fast, right? But we don't want that to sacrifice for cutting corners or making bad decisions, or when something's blaringly obvious and you would see it but you're ignoring it because you just you want to keep proceeding because it's faster to potentially get to market, etc. I think that this reset in the industry accomplished a lot of that, and I think that you see that with just the amount of news flow that's coming out and the frequency of press releases from companies. Whereas, companies including us, you're putting out news multiple times a week, and the news flow is not that of regular biotech companies or traditional drug development companies that put out, basically results when they have results, right? These aren't forward looking, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. We're hypothesizing on this, or we ran 5 preclinical studies, or this and that, right? Like it's when actual tangible real results, an IND approval, the completion of a study, the publishing of results, et cetera, real catalytic events that come out. And I think you're starting to see that now. As far as kind of the race to the clinic, I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer to that. I just, I think that those are other landmines. If somebody puts a compound that kills somebody or something like that, that could be really bad for the industry as well. So, these compounds, and a lot of that should be kind of, before it hits humans. I think there's a good chance that it's going to be weeded out in some of the preclinical, but the race to get into humans, the race to do this, and the race to get your first drug that you're able to synthesize and put through preclinicals and get the pre-IND is probably not the best approach. You want to make sure that your lead candidates are well selected. The reason why you're doing them, is very purposeful, and you're fixing a big problem. That's really, again, something that we've stepped back and analyzed. We have hundreds of compounds in our libraries. And we have 4 lead candidates, right? And we're still selecting lead candidates and still doing work to improve those various candidates, et cetera. And I think that the best psychedelic drug is probably at best in preclinical right now, and maybe not even designed yet, right? So it's not going to be the first one to market. It's not going to be the second one to market, probably. The best drug is yet to come, and I think that people need to understand that as well.
Yeah, we're absolutely. I mean, it's only been a few years since these drugs started to be synthesized. So I think that's a really great point. So last question here. We just have a little bit more time. From an investor perspective, what signs should investors be looking for in companies like yours at this moment in the psychedelic space?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it comes down to explain to me what you mean. What signs?
So we talked a lot about the difficulties of starting a psychedelic company, and biotech in general is really hard to build a successful company. So what should they be looking for so they can see, like Mydecine, that the company and the people behind it have the mindset to overcome these challenges?
Yeah, so I think right now you're seeing a widespread desperation of a lot of companies that I know. And obviously, we're aware of it. We hear about it often. And I know how hard it was for us to take all these steps and to do very hard, make very hard decisions, like the reverse split. You know what I mean? That's something that I've taken an immense amount of scrutiny for personally, right? But I know that it was the right long-term decision to make, right? Our structure is incredibly clean now. The stock will move up very efficiently when we start to actually move the needle. And then obviously a lot of the budget cuts and cutting of staff and cutting of programs and cutting of different things were not easy, and not everybody is willing to do that, right? People are just, they're attached to programs. They don't understand that sometimes they have to make those decisions in order to survive. And again, I know how difficult the capital is to find right now, and at that good capital to find. There's not a lot of it out there right now for companies. There's a lot of companies that need it, and not a lot of capital out there. So I think that ultimately, the best thing that they can do is look at a run rate, look at their burn rate, understand, the talent and the people involved, and really look at their programs and, are they able to bring their programs to fruition with the current model that they have? And if the answer is no, if they need $15 million like we did to get through phase 2B or 3, have they pivoted or brought in a partner that is going to take that weight off their shoulder? And some of it's not all public yet, and some are making those decisions, and it'll come out. And there's a lot going behind the scenes, but I think that that's really, what they need to look at ultimately, and on who's going to be successful and who's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that because capital is so much harder to find than it was when you guys were starting Mydecine, that companies are going to start having the discussions and looking at things the way that you guys have been doing over the past 6 months earlier on in the synthesis of their companies?
For sure. Absolutely. 100%. They don't have the luxury not to, right? So, without question, companies are going to have to be very concise, but I also think that there's a lot more data out there now. People understand kind of maybe where they're going to fit in, but also understand better kind of how this industry is going to spin out and how it's going to evolve. And also, where the capital is going, and people understand what investors are looking for now that actually are writing big checks, right? Before you saw a lot of Canadian bot deals, most of it was either hedge fund driven or retail driven. And then now, some of the larger investment companies that are coming in, and if they're going to make an investment, they'll let you know exactly what their criteria is. This is what we're looking for. And I've had a lot of those calls, right? A lot of those calls. And you have to understand that and take that to heart, because ultimately something that you believe in, and if you want to bring a drug to market that you think is going to be good, you're going to have to adapt your business and mold it to what the people that are writing checks, want to see. And also, these are very sophisticated investors, and they understand, how these things will pan out. And I absolutely have done a lot of research on it too. So you need to make sure that you're paying attention to that and following some of those bigger money investments. And if you see some of those come in and the bigger partnerships happen, I think that you're probably in a good place.
Perfect. Well, that is everything we have time for. Thank you so much for hopping on. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you found this interview valuable, please go ahead and like and subscribe below. You can also head over to our website, psychedelicinvest.com, for lots more unique insights into the psychedelic industry. See you next time.